Hi, this is Paul. I have an idea that's been rolling around in my head that I wanted to get out of my head, and I usually do that through a video. I've been working my way through The Rest is History's excellent series on 1968, really enjoying it, and thinking about the change, not the change in political exposure from, let's say, 1968 until really the change that Donald J. Trump brought onto our political sphere. Now, Trump, of course, has been a politician very different from, he broke the mold in terms of politics. And again, you can debate that. Is it the chaos? Is it the crudeness? Is it the name calling? What is this? Now, almost anyone who has even a view of 19th or 20th century history knows that American politics has always had a dirty edge. But part of the world that I grew up in meant that people would stand on stage and be very measured about what they would say or what they would do. And there was a degree of political cover or press cover that veiled the presidency for the sake of the country. For example, during FDR's administration, you would not see pictures of the president in a wheelchair. You just didn't want to know that. FDR, of course, was when he, I believe, if I'm just doing this from memory, when he died, he was with a mistress. And Eleanor Roosevelt sort of understood about her philandering husband. Now, you have to understand that the beginning of the 20th century, end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, these were the days of the lion waspy administration, where white Anglo-Saxon Protestants ruled the roost. And you certainly should be a church-going man, but you wouldn't necessarily have to practice a church-going ethics. FDR was unfaithful to Eleanor while he was president. I don't know if Harry Truman had affairs. I haven't gone through and looked this up. Maybe I will. All right, here's ChatGPT. So take that. FDR, 1933 to 45, affair with Lucy Mercer Rutherford. This affair became public after Roosevelt's death, and it's well documented in letters and accounts. Eleanor Roosevelt, his wife, reportedly knew about it. John F. Kennedy, Marilyn Monroe, Judith Exner, and several others. JFK's affairs were widely reported, though details remain speculative. His charm and secretive life made him a well-accepted part of his personal history. It's also the case that FDR had terrible medical issues and a lot of pain and was taking a whole variety of drugs while he was president. John F. Kennedy's health issues and use of medications during his presidency has been well documented, particularly in studies of his medical records that were released decades after his assassination. JFK suffered from a range of chronic illnesses and conditions, including Addison's disease, severe back pain, and gastrointestinal issues, leading to the use of various drugs while in office. Addison's disease, a life-threatening adrenal insufficiency diagnosed in the 1940s. Chronic back pain, digestive disorder. So he used corticosteroids used to manage his Addison's disease, enabled him to manage his adrenal function, crucial for surviving the stress of the presidency. Painkillers, morphine and codeine were reported used on his back pain. Occasionally prescribed methadone, stimulants, amphetamines, used to combat fatigue and improve focus. Max Jacobson, nicknamed Dr. Feelgood, was known to administer amphetamine injections, sometimes containing vitamins and other compounds. Tranquilizers, Librium, and barbiturates were sometimes used to address anxiety and insomnia, antispasmodics and antacids, antibiotics. Impact on his presidency. While drugs sometimes helped JFK appear energetic and charismatic, he might have also influenced his mood swings and decision-making. His administration kept his health conditions hidden from the public to maintain an image of vitality, as public knowledge of his illnesses could have affected his political standings. Despite the illnesses and reliance on medication, JFK was able to lead effectively during key moments, such as, that's the opinion of ChatGPT, of course. The extent of his reliance on amphetamines and other drugs has been a topic of debate among historians. LBJ, very colorful character, and his behavior is quite well known. There are voluminous biographies written about LBJ, and I think a lot of this stuff is just scraped from some of these things. 36th President of the United States, known for his larger-than-life personality, which includes a blend of charismatic leadership, shrewd political maneuvering, and notoriously crude and manipulative behaviors. His conduct, often referred to as the Johnson treatment, was both persuasion and expression of his dominant and sometimes overbearing nature. Dominic Sandbrook talks about this quite a bit in their treatment of LBJ. He'd have his hands all over you. He's a big guy. He'd lean up against you, and you just get the sense that this guy was, pushing you into what he wanted. He was also called the master of the Senate. He was a masterful politician and was able to get a ton of stuff done through the Senate. Vulgar language. LBJ frequently used profanity and off-color remarks, even in formal settings. His language was often blunt and shocking, but it reflected his unfiltered personality. Examples include making crude jokes and using colorful metaphors about political opponents and situations. Bathroom meetings. It was infamous for continuing conversations with staff and aides while using the toilet, sometimes leaving the door open to assert dominance and discomfort. He liked showing people his Johnson. This behavior was a deliberate tactic to throw people off their balance. LBJ often invaded personal space, leaning into other people's faces, grabbing their lapels, or towering over them to emphasize his point. He used his 6'3" stature and forceful personality to intimidate and empower others. LBJ was known for exposing himself and making crude references to his anatomy. For example, he nicknamed his penis Jumbo and reportedly showed it off in informal settings to shock and amuse. This is the President of the United States. Now, I'm sure these things were known in Washington, but not written about in the papers and not talked about in the evening news. So you had a certain kayfabe of keeping up appearances. And I think that really sort of held, and people would, of course, always sort of flirt with that line because, of course, to get edgy, it gets attention. You can read Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death and kind of get a sense of, okay, what's all of this about? Why? It seems that there's always a culture, there's always kayfabe, there's always a way to communicate competence, respectability. Now, I think a lot of this came out of those early WASPy years. David Brooks just recently wrote a piece in The Atlantic, and I don't have a subscription, so I haven't read it, but a number of people have pointed me to it, and he just gave a treatment of it on Amanpour and Company.
The diploma divide, the political divide, grows out of a deep cultural divide. And so increasingly people with college degrees and people with high school degrees are living in different worlds. People with high school degrees die 8 years younger.
Now, again, a lot of people noted, Cale Zeldin posted on Twitter a map that if only people with college degrees were allowed to vote, what would the electoral college map look like for the past election? And it's dramatically different. Okay, let's go back here.
Yana, thanks. David Brooks, thanks so much for joining us. Your recent cover story in The Atlantic dives into how essentially we have created a system of meritocracy that isn't working, that's created a diploma divide in America. You write, the meritocracy has provoked a populist backlash that is tearing society apart. Today, the most significant political divide is along educational lines. Less educated people vote Republican, and more educated people vote Democratic. So how did one lead to the other?
Well, the diploma divide, the political divide, grows out of a deep cultural divide. And so increasingly people with college degrees and people with high school degrees are living in different worlds. People with high school degrees die 8 years younger. They're 10 times more likely to die of opioid addiction. They're much more likely to be obese. They're much less likely to marry. They're much, much more likely to have kids out of wedlock. They even have fewer friends. 24% of high school grads say they have no close friends. And so we have created two different Americas. And we created that unintentionally, but on purpose. Over the last 70 years, we created a world in which people who do really well in school get to go to fancy colleges, marry each other, invest heavily in their kids. They get to go to fancy colleges. They move to the same 10 or 12 cities, Austin, San Francisco, Washington, and they've created an inherited caste structure. And 50% of America takes a look at this and says, you educated elites, you have too much power. And by the way, you're not all that competent. So we're going to revolt. And that's what Donald Trump is all about.
You know, you kind of go back into the history of the interest of the Harvard president almost 100 years ago. How does that translate into this situation that you're describing?
Yeah, the guy's name was James Conant, and he inherited a situation, which was getting into Harvard was super easy if your dad went to Harvard. Harvard and Princeton and Yale and schools like that were for the Protestant establishment. And so the ideal in those days was to be a well-bred man. And you didn't want to study hard. Academics were not important.
Okay, now to be a well-bred man, I mean, that's all about keeping up appearances. That's all about cultural mannerisms of displaying something. Now, again, you've basically got, he's trying to break up the fact that you've basically got an oligarchy, and what you're going to have is you're still going to have an oligarchy, but it's sort of going to shift. But again, it's all about looking competent or appearing a certain way.
But you had to be socially polished. And he decided that's ridiculous. We can't enter the 20th century governed by the dim-witted children of Mayflower families. We need a new kind of elite. And he had great faith in the power of IQ tests and in the power of GPA, getting really good grades. So he said, we're going to pluck.
Okay, so now you've got we're gonna apply science to this. We're gonna use IQ tests, and we're gonna measure these things.
All the smart kids from all across America, we'll bring them to places like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and they'll run the society really well. So inherently, he was creating a new elite. The problem with his vision was that rich families learned to game the system. And the second problem with his system is he didn't have the right definition of human ability. For him, it was all IQ. And IQ is important. It really is. If you want to be an astrophysicist, probably important to have a high IQ. But those of us who, live life know there are other things that are more important. Being curious, having a passionate drive, being a good teammate, agility, knowing how to move in life so you're graceful toward other people and decisive toward yourself. And so all the...
Now, you can debate Brooks's tack on this because, it's very interesting because in many ways we just sort of shift away from one group of elites to another. That McDonald's on the plane picture where you had Trump, Musk, JFK Jr., Donald Trump Jr., and then the Speaker of the House in the back. It's like, yeah, we've still got billionaires with high IQs in charge. And it's that way in that when JFK came into office, he, had the brain trust and everybody was going to be experts. And so you could see with, let's say, the JFK administration where here you have a war hero, but he was also the son of a very ambitious, wealthy man who very much promoted his sons to be ambitious and wealthy. It's very interesting what shifts and what doesn't. But again, you still have sort of this new veneer of a new cool. Now, this gets very interesting as the 60s continue to develop, because then when Robert Kennedy starts going for office, Robert Kennedy, a different kind of man, has a huge family with his wife. He's committed to his wife. He's not philandering like his older brother. He's prickly. There's all sorts of, he's not sort of as smooth and as charismatic as his older brother was, but he sort of gets a cachet among a certain group of people. But again, I very much recommend The Rest is History in that series. I'll put some links to they've got them on YouTube now as well as in the podcast. But it's very interesting how you see these different emphases moving in and out.
These traits, which were hard to measure, got lopped off. And so we not only created this elites, this inherited caste system, but it's not that competent because it doesn't select on the basis of what are the real skills in society.
Is it okay to ascribe this current situation to the meritocracy in the amount that you do?
Did you hear that question? Is it okay to ascribe? What are you asking? Are you asking morality? There's a video going on TikTok where this young woman who was very angry about the election was just sort of screaming about how there was a coworker that she found out who was competent and intelligent, and this coworker voted for Donald Trump. And this young woman just basically gets on her moral high horse and says the most, it's absolutely fine for me to hate him, blah, 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 blah. And it's like, well, I thought not too many years ago, hate was the enemy and hate has no place here. But now it's okay to hate these people, but not these other people. So I guess the whole hate thing didn't really pan out. And so much of what we get is this conversation is it okay now? We're just all sort of morally checking each other. Well, what can I say? And what am I allowed to say? And it's just absolutely fascinating the way this discourse has evolved.
Meaning, are you, David Brooks, giving enough credit to the social policies that multiple administrations have come up with that might have exacerbated the very dichotomy in America that we're describing? Is it all the meritocracy? Aren't other things responsible for this as well?
I'm monomaniacal about this, so maybe I oversee it. But I would put it this way.
Well, I think part of the point here is that, again, you have the problem of category. So, well, competence broadly. Okay, well, let's go back. There's this great scene in this movie. There's this great scene in this movie, Another Round, that one of you recommended to me, where basically reads the description of 3 world leaders and asks which one would make the best leader. And it had Churchill and Roosevelt and Hitler. And of course, he didn't tell them which was which, and they all selected Hitler. Well, he was a vegetarian, and he was very clean, and he was very ordinary, and he was a very popular speaker. And of course, Churchill drank too much, and FDR was sort of he was sort of your classic elitist who, and you can go back and look at John F. Kennedy. He's on the $half. LBJ, he's not on anything. Martin Luther King Jr., of course, had marital affairs. And in 2027, when the FBI recordings are unsealed, that'll be under a Trump administration when that happens. So there'll be a valence pointed at that, even though whoever would win, that's when it's set to be unsealed. So what's the point of all of this? It's interesting how the kayfabes shift and how there was a kayfabe and then there's a new kayfabe. And one of the interesting things in terms of listening to The Rest is History and the coverage of 1968 was that when we look back and think about sort of this filter through hippies, it's very interesting how the valences have shifted. I thought it was interesting that this was when Greg Laurie's Jordan Peterson video came out. So it's interesting how we have these competing kayfabes, because it's sort of the keeping up appearances sort of established by the waspy lions of the early 20th century that was maintained until really the counterculture makes it uncool, but there's a lag effect, and now suddenly it's transparency. So an irony of this is that when Bill Clinton has an affair with Monica Lewinsky, how do we manage that? The other affairs covered up. Bill Clinton and now Donald Trump. The irony of this is that for Donald Trump to philander while he's in office, it's going to take some doing, because if somebody finds it out, it's coming right out. And of course, Jonathan Edwards, the Democratic presidential candidate, had that affair. All the transparency sort of provokes well, transparency in some ways provokes accountability, but the accountability is never quite what you think it is, because the level of kayfabe, which is sort of this spirit that arises from the zeitgeist and is debated, that's in the mix. So I don't know. We'll have to see if this video goes through.